He's told the military to be ready by 2027. 2027 is next year. We have to be on our guard in case such an attack happens. The idea that China can somehow just take over neighbours using military force is a very disturbing one, because where would it stop? Well, the latest satellite images show us that China is serious about its military preparations for a possible conflict with the US. What we are seeing is, some pretty advanced wargaming concepts, working out in China, working out what the enemy might be able to put into the field and how you could strike against it. Now, of course, it's no substitute for actual combat experience, but it's the closest thing the Chinese can do to try and, kind of work out the weak points in potential US defences. So I think we should be obviously very concerned that this is happening. And that the Chinese may be seeing this as part of their preparations, whatever they may be thinking might be next in their plans for Taiwan. Well, the purpose of building this sort of, it's not even a shadow fleet, this desert fleet as it were, was simply to practice lines of attack, to see what might happen should missiles strike in certain places, naval tactics, what might be advantageous through drones, that sort of approach. It's obviously, again, not a substitute for combat action. It doesn't tell you how the Americans would act. What they're trying to do here is A, send a message saying we're ready, but B, trying to see if they can work out unique weak points in the American defences that might be exploitable by Chinese offensive action. Well, the purpose, of course, is you're moving the ships around, because, of course, the ships won't be static in combat, so you're using the railways to get them into position and then to maybe simulate what happens during an attack of some kind. Again, this won't be a perfect replica because you can't necessarily calculate, if a ship goes 90 degrees, that's going to be very difficult to replicate on a rail approach. But it's designed to maybe show targeting, to see, how you have to calibrate your weaponry and what other tactics you might want to adopt to a moving set of targets, and then to work out your best model of attack against them. It's not a perfect representation. It's not going to, kind of give the Chinese some kind of magical moment where they can go, aha, that's going to be the key to destroying the American fleet, to stop them from stopping us from doing what we want to do. But it gives them just another way to test out their weaponry and to test out their simulated ideas for how you deal with the most advanced navy in the world. Or what it tells you is that the Chinese are preparing for an eventuality of a conflict, and that suggests that they may think that such a conflict might emerge, and they are preparing as best they can for it. They're not a scare tactic, because of course they're designed to help the Chinese military prepare. We know that Xi has said he would like the sort of reunification of Taiwan with China. He's told the military to be ready by 2027. 2027 is next year. So we have to be on our guard in case such an attack happens. Given that he's given a 2027 deadline for for being ready for a reunification of Taiwan operation, and given that we know there are certain periods in 2027 which are uniquely propitious for a naval invasion, I think we have to assume that he's serious. Now, that doesn't mean it'll happen, of course. We can still deter it, prevent it, but we have to assume that when someone says be ready, they're going to be ready. So the conditions relate to lunar movements that change the way the sea operates. It's rather like D-Day. If you remember, in June 1944, there were only a couple of days when a D-Day landing was seen as viable. And on day one, there was a storm, but on day two, that this was viable, they were able to get across. And had they not done so, the theory at least was they wouldn't have been able to do so till 1945. Well, because again, what they're looking to do here is to see the enemy design, as it were, and to see how it would assume they might operate in practice. Now, of course, they don't have actual American planes that they can actually utilize for this purpose. So what they're doing is somewhat, speculative. But it just gives a sense to the Chinese forces of the kinds of things they might see, of course, in a conflict and in combat situation, and enables them to just get a better sense of, what they might be up against. So part of this is psychological training, I think, as much as anything else for the Chinese military. It doesn't, of course, you can't fly these planes in terms of replicating US maneuvering and how this would operate, but it gives a sense, look, psychologically, that's what you're going to be up against. This is what we think you can do against them, and we're going to, try and show you how to destroy them. But it's very interesting the Chinese have, of course, built a copy of this naval base because a lot of the wargaming scenarios that have been used by the US, actually, by US modelers, obviously bring in the fact that there will be collateral damage to neighbouring countries as well, and that, of course, the Chinese will look to attack American bases in the region, just as, for example, the Iranians have, of course, attacked American bases across the Middle East in the current conflict in Iran. So it's a pretty standard, kind of idea that you won't sort of restrict things simply to units that are maybe engaging in combat, but you're going to try and take the fight to the enemy, much like the Japanese in 1941, of course, attacked Pearl Harbor, which was well away from where the sort of activity was, because warships were there and they felt they could deal a hammer blow by going further afield. So the aim would be, of course, to stop resupply, to stop the Americans using this very important base during the conflict to restock or resupply, or to bring in other forces to the zone of operations. And so they are sending, again, a very clear message saying, don't think that you'll be able to hide within allied countries. We will look to attack you wherever you might be if you get involved in our business. Well, the assumption has to be that by building a model of downtown Taipei, they're presuming that there will be hand-to-hand fighting, in that area, and that they'll have to clear out Taiwanese defending forces block by block. It's similar in a sense to what the Israelis prepared for when they were going into Gaza, trying to look at a very dense urban environment and working out how do you defeat an enemy ensconced within urban terrain. So the Chinese will be looking at this, working out where the Taiwanese defensive points might be and what it would take to actually dislodge Taiwanese defenders from city block after city block in order to move forward. So it'll form a component part again of that process. Although there, of course, is an argument that if the Chinese ever got to the stage where they had to go block by block in Taipei, that they would be in great danger of losing this conflict rather than winning it, because the Taiwanese defenders are likely to, of course, have significant advantages in urban environments, given they know the urban space much better and will be able to use it as defensive cover for whatever they would be doing to stop the Chinese. So it's perhaps more a sort of a warning to the Taiwanese to say, we are trying to cover every eventuality, rather than necessarily being part of what the Chinese would intend to do, although, of course, they might be required to do it should they actually engage in that kind of invasion. Well, the question, of course, of deterrence here, prevention, is key to the whole Taiwanese tactic. In fact, if you can argue that the entire sort of period of the last 30, 40 years has been spent with the West basically deterring the idea of an attack on Taiwan through having some strategic confusion about what it might intend to do and respond, and how it would respond in that way. This might, of course, have led to the Chinese measures now. They're going, right, well, we are going to assume the West is going to get involved somehow. They are going to do this, and our message is that we will win regardless of that. But the reality is that the Chinese can still be deterred and prevented, because the Chinese will have seen what should have been slam dunk operations, such as the Russian attack on Ukraine, fail. And so they'll be very concerned about getting engaged in a very difficult amphibious assault on a country which obviously would resist them heavily. And they would obviously not want to lose that. So the real challenge for the West right now is to make the likelihood of Chinese defeat stronger from a theoretical perspective, for the Chinese to have very serious, therefore, second thoughts about whether they should be actually engaging in this kind of military operation rather than focusing on other activities to bring Taiwan together to them. Not that, again, the Taiwanese should engage with that, but it's simply what the Chinese are trying to do versus what the Taiwanese are trying to do. And we are very keen on avoiding a shooting war. The reason for that, of course, is that it would disrupt global trade quite significantly. We get a lot of trade, obviously, from Northeast Asia. It comes through very long supply chains to reach Europe and beyond. And any disruption to that could be quite critical, in particular, of course, in the area of microchips. Of course, the Taiwanese are significant providers of those to the global market. A sudden shortage of those caused by a long conflict would be very destructive for a lot of UK consumer goods, and obviously, and also more than that, into business, industry, we are quite reliant on these chips right now. We do not want to see disruptions in that way. And of course, there could be second order effects if the Chinese are extending the war to Japan, beyond. A lot more trade gets disrupted. And that could, of course, have huge implications on the global economy, but also here for us in the UK, given a lot of the goods we receive these days are coming from China or beyond. That you would expect significant disruption of that, and that would obviously have an immediate effect here in the UK. Well, a lot would depend on the American response. In fact, it all depends on the American response. If the Americans did nothing, then it wouldn't be World War III. That is not a reason not to do nothing, though. The idea that China can somehow just take over neighbours using military force is a very disturbing one, because where would it stop? Do the Chinese actually have ambitions beyond in other places? Would they then want to throw their weight around on the next target? Could South Korea be in their sights? Could Japan? All this is very the Philippines. There are many disputes the Chinese have in their neighbourhood with countries, which they could quite easily, if they chose to, try and resort to war and conflict. And as always, appeasing a power who means you ill is not a good way to go about safeguarding your own national security. So the reality would be, what would the Americans do, and what could others do to help them? Britain's a long way away. We don't have the military force to really participate in anything of this kind, but we should obviously be supporting the Americans should they decide to, as we hope they would do, defend a free world nation under attack in this way. Could it end up in World War III? Well, that depends on how it goes. I mean, the Americans did a lot of military wargaming fairly recently on this. All the scenarios came out with the Americans winning, not the Chinese. However, there were questions about the longevity of that victory and what might happen if there was a round two and beyond. And we're seeing already with the Iranian conflict that round two, round three, round four is entirely possible with these things. And over time, the Chinese could certainly attrit American forces and cause significant problems for Western forces in the Indo-Pacific full stop. Mainly because we haven't got our industrial house in order for resupply of materials, of missiles, of anti-missile defense, and all the rest of it in that sort of way. So a lot of this comes down to preparedness for conflict in the West. And of course, the longer that we can hold off a conflict in Taiwan and reposition our industries and our defences to deal with prospective threat, the more likely, firstly, it is that we don't have those conflicts in the first place, because we will be in a better position. The Chinese will know that. And the second is that should the worst come to the worst, we would have the ability to win out not simply the original conflict, but also further rounds beyond that, to make sure that there was no Chinese victory in that regard. So China's fixed on the Taiwan issue because China sees Taiwan as an integral part of China. It was, of course, at one point an integral part of China. It's undergone several changes of ownership, per se, since then. The Portuguese had a crack at one point, and of course, Taiwan then became the base for Chiang Kai-shek, who was the nationalist ruler of China in the 1930s and 40s. He fled there after the Chinese Civil War, which Mao, of course, and the communists won, and set up his own alternative base. And a little-known fact is that Taiwan held, extraordinarily, the Chinese seat on the UN Security Council until the 1970s, not China, because Chiang had been the victor of the Second World War. He was part of the Victory Alliance, of course, and he wasn't prepared to give it up until he was essentially forced to over time. The other strange fact is that the greatest collection of Chinese historical artifacts and treasures are in Taiwan, not in China. And the reason for that is firstly because Chiang shipped a load of them over to Taiwan after the Civil War. But secondly, the Chinese themselves, the mainland Chinese, destroyed a great proportion of their great treasures during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao decided that these were symptoms of decadence and corruption, and had sort of reams of Chinese history destroyed by his own forces. So they want to get that back as well, essentially, which is part of their common heritage. Of course it is. But the reality is that Taiwan is a successful, free democracy that increasingly doesn't want to be part of China. In its early stages, it pretended to be the government of China and wanted reunification, but on its terms, not on China's terms, in that respect. That view has gone very much out of fashion over time, given that generations of Taiwanese have now been born into a free country and wouldn't want to be returned to communist rule. For China, it's a great affront, of course. They regard it, for many reasons, as a holdout, as Hong Kong was, an imperial holdout as Hong Kong was in their view, and they would like it back, which explains, of course, their insistence on it. But the reality is Taiwan should have a say in its own future, and the Taiwanese show no interest on a large scale in returning to any kind of rule by China.